All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started back up again. Up next, we have Richard Wakeman from Microsoft, who's going to be talking about some of the things that him and his team have been working on recently.
All right, good. Hey, good afternoon. So I'm Richard Wakeman, the Senior Director for Aerospace and Defense within our Azure Global Engineering organization. So I focus on the unique requirements for the defense industrial base. Our engineering team is that runs and operates our sovereign clouds, in particular Azure Government for unclassified workloads. Our team also manages the clouds for our classified environments as well. So we've got Azure Government Secret for IL6 and ICD 503, and of course, a top secret cloud coming on next year, and that's in alignment with our requirements for the JEDI contract. We do work very closely with other engineering orgs across the company, especially in regards to the cybersecurity maturity model certification. So I lead a V team across Microsoft and the construction of what we have been announcing, the CMMC acceleration program, which I'll get into in a bit more detail as we go on. Next slide. Excellent. So Microsoft has the implementation of the most standards and accreditations, attestations of any cloud service provider, on the market today. In particular, if you look at that second row for the U.S. government, we meet all the stringent requirements in alignment with the U.S. Federal government, including the U.S. Department of Defense. So you'll notice that we have a series of certifications, for example, an authority to operate for FedRAMP High in most of our clouds, as well as with the DoD security requirements guideline. And if you look at how that lines up to our various different cloud service offerings, you could move forward to the next slide. I've explained this in really detail in a number of blogs, a series of blogs that I have out on our tech community. And these will be links to that. Of course, you can find it off of my my LinkedIn profile as well. Go one more slide forward. So there is a much longer description of how we ended up with multiple different data enclaves in support of the U.S. government compliance and data regulations. So if you look at, for example, our initial introduction into the public multi-tenant cloud was with our productivity suite. That was Microsoft 365, Office 365, and ultimately over time we've delivered that into many different markets, including the ability to do regional, what we call geos. So you can have a multi-geo tenant and be able to have data residency within many different countries around the world. So for example, oftentimes with the DIB, they have presence in Five Eyes. So you'd have regions in Canada, UK, Australia, etc. Now, the restriction here is that with our public multi-tenant offerings, there is a global network and, of course, a global support operations, follow the sun, for example, for product support, which really prohibits us from being able to have a contractual obligation to some of the important regulations and standards for the defense industrial base in particular. Now, if you go back and you look at our first data enclave that we built for the U.S. government, in particular state and local government and federal civilian agencies, that was the government community cloud, or what we've oftentimes would call GCC, Office 365 GCC. It did predate the construction of Azure Commercial. So as we began to build out infrastructure as a service and platform as a service, that evolved at the same time as our government community cloud offering. So what you'll find is that GCC is paired up with Azure Commercial. And this is an important call out because things like Azure Sentinel and Windows Virtual Desktop in support of GCC are hosted out of Azure Commercial. Now, we do have a FedRAMP High accreditation across both Azure Commercial and GCC. We also have DFAR 7012 compliance within GCC. However, we do not have DFAR 7012 in commercials. That continues to be a sticking point. Now, move forward in time, approximately 5 years ago, we introduced a truly sovereign cloud with Azure Government. In our introduction of Azure Government, it was in particular in requirement for the SRG and delivering a cloud solution for the U.S. Department of Defense. So you'll find that the Azure Government environment does meet Impact Level 5, as well as FedRAMP High authority to operate. And we also have now a platform to deliver software as a service. So if you look at, for example, the productivity suite, we initially built out Office 365 Defense, now what we'll call DoD, for an IL5 control set. Now, the restriction of the DoD environment is that it's only available and eligible for DoD agencies proper. So it really restricted the defense industrial base, as well as even some of the federal cabinet level agencies like the FBI, DOG, DHS, et cetera, from being able to procure tenants there. So we built a twin copy of the DoD environment, what's now branded Microsoft 365 GCC High. Don't be confused by branding though, because if you look at typically any of the branding for GCC High is software as a service versus infrastructure as a service, a platform as a service would be branded Azure Government in the case of the U.S. Sovereign Cloud. There are services like Azure Active Directory hosted out of Azure Government that are branded GCC High. And we also have Dynamics 365 GCC High and about to announce GitHub private instances that are hosted within Azure Government. So continuing to build out that and have that commitment. Now, what you'll find is, because we do meet that restriction, no foreign for the IL5 environment, that is a benefit for the defense industrial base, because you have now full coverage for QE in terms of looking at both QE basic as well as with ITAR and other export control data. Next slide. This is really a summation of how our each one of the different compliance regimes align. You'll see the far right two columns are U.S. Sovereign Cloud. Big call out here. I mean, we could spend an hour on this slide alone and have spent days with some customers and their legal teams, but I'll find that the big call out here, if you just hit the space bar, is a circle around DFARS 7012 within GCC High and Azure Government, as well as for ITAR export controls and full coverage for controlled and classified information. You may have noticed that we announced that GCC does have a FedRAMP High accreditation now. So I'll update this slide, but there's still that restriction for ITAR within the GCC environment. So it's still for the higher bar, for the higher watermark for compliance and protection of QE, that would be in alignment with GCC High and Azure Government. Next slide. So in terms of looking at Microsoft and our strategy for the cybersecurity maturity model certification, I've written a few articles here linked out. In fact, one of them was just posted yesterday. That's a program update, and I'll just give you a quick summary of that here today on our session. One big call out is that whenever we talk about the CMMC acceleration and how Microsoft is working with our customers to meet the requirements of CMMC, this is very specifically in the constraint of us being a cloud service provider. So that's the products as opposed to Microsoft, the enterprise. There's a whole nother set of talking points, that's run out of our another organization for how Microsoft gets certified for CMMC. But if you look at us for a cloud service provider, a big thing that we've been working on is building a program of reciprocity. And whenever I say reciprocity, it means that, if you have a tenant and you're running on the Microsoft platform, whether it's with services, a subscription in Azure Government, or within Office 365, GCCI, or any of our cloud service offerings, that you're able to leverage those existing investments that we've already made in things like the FedRAMP, right? So, for example, our system security plan for all of our clouds are grounded on NIST, especially looking at 853, and that provides a baseline set of controls that you, of course, are able to take advantage of and essentially inherit from. That would include additional investments we've made also with the DoD Cloud Computing Security Requirements Guideline, that's the SRG. For example, we have IL2 in our Azure commercial offerings. We have IL4 and IL5 available in our government clouds. Of course, if you look at IL4 and IL5, those are in protection of not just Q, but also full data sovereignty, for example, protection of ITAR and FOUO. Now, if we get into DFAR 7012, there is also the ability to demonstrate compliance, and that Microsoft does have the right back-end support systems to be able to, for example, assist you with incident reporting for the DFAR 7012 C through G clauses. We also do demonstrate adoption of the Cybersecurity Framework, CSF. So all of these paired together give a program of reciprocity that really does enable you to host workloads on the Microsoft Cloud Platform, and it's depending on which cloud you choose, whether it's commercial or GCC or GCC High, will give you those underlying protections and of course contractual commitments to things like ITAR and our government clouds. Next slide. CMMC acceleration program is targeting a CMMC level 3 initially. CMMC level 1 is more process oriented, so we were looking at ultimately being able to deliver a set of capabilities. So just to be clear, the CMMC acceleration program isn't a product or something you have to go buy or pay for. It is a collection of resources that we have assembled together, some of which are delivered through our Azure Global Engineering organization, others through Office, and other organizations like we're working with the Sentinel product group for workbooks, etc. That all come together in a single program that we can deliver to you. The goal is to be able to enable a pre-configured environment of either Office 365 or a subscription in Azure that would have all the knobs and dials configured in such a manner that would maximize the coverage of the cybersecurity maturity model for certification for a level 3. Now, if you look at the vast majority of those practices for CMMC level 3, they are customer scope of responsibility. So if you look at all this configuration, it's kind of intended to be the easy button for you, right? But we also recognize that Microsoft cannot take you the full stretch, right? That there's many process-oriented controls, and there's, of course, a consultative angle to how your organization would become compliant with CMMC level 3. So much of the CMMC acceleration program is targeted at working with our partner community. For example, we have a number of MSPs, managed service providers, and MSSPs, system security service providers that we work with that would use the program as a set of scaffolding. Right. Next slide. So just to delve quickly into some of the components that we've released here as part of the program in this current calendar year. So we have the Microsoft Compliance Manager. We were super excited to bring that general availability at Ignite this year, so just several weeks ago. And the Compliance Manager has a tremendous amount of value out of the box. Essentially, our GRC tool, right, that's paired up with software as a service. So it extends across the entire Microsoft 365 product stack, Office 365, and the security suite, if you will, things like Azure Information Protection and MCAS and Intune, etc. Now, if you look at the ability to do an overlay in the compliance manager so that it is aligned with either NIST 800-171 or with CMMC, we do have a set of assessment templates that ultimately enable you to configure inside of your tenant, that gives you a way to illustrate all of the actions that are required by you to configure your tenant in order to become more compliant with CMMC. By way of example, if you were to drop the CMMC assessment template level 3, there's a MFA requirement. And if you follow the action and guideline for MFA, not only would it enforce it in your tenant, but it would also raise your compliance score in alignment with completing that activity. It is only available in commercial today. We do have that coming online by the end of this calendar year, maybe even surprise you with that in November timeframe. Next slide. Azure Security Center is, in a similar vein to the Compliance Manager, is available in Azure Infrastructure as a Service and Platform as a Service. So if you go into the Azure portal and you navigate to what's now called Azure Defender, Azure Security Center, it has the ability for you to look at a similar security score, secure score, for the configuration of things like virtual machines and virtual networking. With that as an overlay of Azure Blueprints, we have a number of samples already available today for Azure Blueprints for NIST 800-171. We're currently engineering the CMMC Level 3 blueprint that will become available in a private preview next month. If you're interested, definitely reach out to me at cmmc@microsoft.com. That blueprint will be a set of policy initiatives. It's similar to the assessment templates of the Compliance Manager, to have a view of how you've configured the tenant. And what we'll also build into the blueprints, if you just move one more slide forward, are a set of reference architectures that even go a step further. It's not just policy and enforcement of policy, it's now the ability to pre-configure your subscription. So we've built a zero trust architecture blueprints available today on GitHub. We have a version 2 of that will land in the December timeframe. And our plan is, and we would have already tackled having the zero trust model map into CMMC, but as many of you know, there's been a bit of a moving target in terms of how we can establish a program of reciprocity and understand, how CMMC and NIST 800-171 all map into the zero trust architecture. So it's been delayed a bit. What I plan on doing is getting the zero trust blueprint delivered in December, and then we'll come back around and map it back into and make adjustments to support CMMC. But I do encourage you to go ahead and look at the available repo for zero trust. Slide 4, please. Super excited about enabling this. So we were building a whole bunch of different product documentation to support CMMC. There was a crosswalk between NIST 853, 171, of course, CMMC level 3, and it just got super convoluted in terms of trying to visualize how they not only crosswalk, but if you have a single consolidated set of customer implementation guidance, that it was very difficult to put that into, for example, a spreadsheet that could be consumed easily. And what we ended up doing is building this, what appears to be like a periodic chart of the CMMC level 3. So it's using the schema of CMMC. We'll call it the product placemat. The benefit of the placemat is you can see what's inherited from the platform, but you can also go and select various different products. So, for example, you can select Intune, and whenever you light up Intune, it'll show you all of the practices that Intune either contributes to as a primary service or a secondary service. I've got, of course, the entire E5 suite selected now in this particular snapshot view of it, but it is an interactive spreadsheet. And if you double click on any one of the practices, you'll get a drill down, and you'll have the ability to not only see which products contribute to compliance of that particular practice, but it also gives you customer implementation guidance and details. And our intention is, as we roll out blueprints and these reference architectures, it will give you a documentation package, including this place map, but also like a mini SSP that you can use to be able to submit to the C3PAO auditor to help close the gap in the scope of responsibility for you to achieve your own certification. One more slide left in the presentation. I'm probably going over a little bit here, but I'll wrap it up quickly. So we have had this wonderful, I said very busy, but it's also, makes your eye pop looking at the cybersecurity reference architecture that my friend Mark Simos has constructed. He's working on a new version of this, of course, using some of the new branding. And I'll look for that in the next couple of weeks. But this cybersecurity reference architecture pulls together all of the products that we have across Microsoft 365, E5, Defender, etc., to have a single view where you can see how conditional access is satisfied, data protection, information protection policies are implemented, identity and access management, etc. This is available today. If you go out to my blog article that references the CMMC acceleration program, I've got links to each of these in terms of a program. And as we go into the next calendar year, after we've released several of these artifacts, you'll see us doing a lot more, even with Office 365, for example, building out mini SSP for those people who are running in Office 365, and of course reference architectures there as well. So that's a wrap on today. I encourage you, if you have an opportunity, to reach out to me at cmmc@microsoft.com, and happy to work with you on the acceleration program. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Richard, for an overview of everything that you've been working on over at Microsoft. At this time, I'm going to turn things over to Ryan Bonner with DefCert.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ryan Bonner. I'm an independent compliance consultant working on a lot of DFARS and CMMC related topics. And I'm really excited that I got to present after Richard Wakeman at Microsoft, because I think some of the things we just saw were a lot of different ways that CMMC can be tackled using a lot of the built-in tools in ecosystems such as the one provided by Microsoft. And I think the reason I'm excited to present after Richard is because things like that, you're looking at something like that large cybersecurity reference architecture, or a sort of map of all the different ways that you can leverage those tools, really demonstrates what I would look at as cost avoidance. So you can get a bunch of different capabilities out of a single seat license or things like that. It's definitely going to provide a lot of cost savings compared to necessarily going after them one at a time or things like that, sort of in traditional architectures. So that's really cool to be a part of that. Today's conversation is really just going to peel off of that a bit and go more into the non-technical side of things. But again, the theme here is also cost avoidance. So today, what we really want to talk about is dumpster diving for some open source CMMC resources. So if we go to the first slide here, I think what we mean when we say that we're dumpster diving is that we're really looking to leverage the methods that we have available to us today, or the resources that are available to us now that might have come out 6 months ago, a year ago, 2 years ago, even further back, and were never really applied to the CMMC ecosystem in the way that maybe they could be. And so if we're looking to make sense of the world around us now while we wait on additional guidance down the road for things like the CMMC assessment processes, the guides, the methodologies, the things like that we're all waiting for, there's a surprising amount of information available to us today that if we can piece it all together, digging through the refuse of past publications and past guidance and past defense industrial-based programs, we can really find a lot there to move forward confidently, reduce the uncertainty, and actually begin implementing maybe even ahead of the industry at large. So let's kind of dig into the first, what I would call dumpster find, things that have been released and are no longer dazzling and are often ignored, but that have huge bearing on us today that we can plan around. So the first thing I have here is what I would call a gently used assessment guide. I say that because when NIST Special Publication 800-171A was first released, not a lot of people gave it the fanfare that it deserved, especially when you understand what it accomplishes. And I really wanted to point out what's driving my focus on this in today's landscape when we look at CMMC. So back in June, ISOO, the Information Security Oversight Office, they released some guidance on how to assess organizations. And they made some really clear statements, which is any entity, so they're not saying an agency here, any entity that assesses compliance with 800-171 must use what we find in 800-171A. So they're specifically talking about these procedures. And I didn't include the rest of the verbiage. You can look up that notice that came out earlier this summer. But some of the other things they talk about is the need for assessors to pre-disclose the objects from this guide that they intend to use in an assessment. So let's jump to the next slide. Here's why I'm so interested in 800-171A as it pertains to planning around CMMC. This is just an example of the chart that we're given for each of the 800-171 requirements. And just to clarify, all 110 requirements from 800-171 are represented in their entirety in CMMC. So just so that you understand the superset that we're dealing with in CMMC by its nature includes 800-171. So when we look at a single requirement from 800-171, in this case, we're looking at 3.4.9, we actually, in more cases, have a number of assessment objectives that have to be met. So you can see in this case, for one requirement, I've got 3 objectives. And I'm also given these lists. These lists contain specific objects. So not to be confused with the objectives that are bracketed and lettered just above, but the actual objects themselves. So what am I looking at here? In the list titled Examine, I'm being given the names of documents, and I'm being given the characteristics of documents that can be examined by an assessor. And then under this interview list, I'm being told about the specific responsibilities, so namely people that I would talk to with these responsibilities. So again, this topic is being scoped by the area of responsibility someone might have. And then finally, we have this test list, which almost always mentions organizational processes that you could observe or specific mechanisms that you could test, maybe through a practical demonstration or a testing procedure that you might come up with in advance. So if I'm an assessor assessing an organization in regards to 800-171, then I'm effectively going to be basing all of my document requests that I put forward to an organization that I'm assessing, or the people that I choose to talk to, or the practical demonstrations that I want to see when I come on site. I'm basing them on this document. And that really helps me stay within the guardrails of the ISOO guidance that I just mentioned. So why am I so focused on this? Next slide. The first thing to keep in mind is that if we know the 800-171 requirement and the objectives that we see here for assessment, we can begin to plan our CMMC assessment. So all I'm doing is showing you here that 3.4.9 and 800-171 is represented as CM 2.063 in CMMC. And if all I were to do was just to switch out the requirement versus the practice designation, I effectively have the assessment objectives that I should be planning around. We've gotten a lot of great feedback from the folks at the DIBCAC teams operating at DCMA, that any future CMMC efforts are going to be largely based on 801.71a. So I think it's a safe bet to begin planning how we are going to perform in an assessment based on these objectives that are already available to us. So, roughly 85% of the CMMC level 3 practices already have placeholder assessment objectives that we can start planning around. If you go to the next slide, I also want to show what I'm really interested in from this guide and what it can do for us for the rest of the CMMC model that's new. And I really only say it's new in quotes because at the end of the day, it's really not. One of the underlying assumptions for 801.71 is that any organization who picks up the document already has a cybersecurity program, and that there's certain obvious things like policy or procedure or records keeping or assigned responsibilities or plans that are just a necessary evil of having any program. And so if that's true, then NIST already assumed we would have those going in, and you find those represented in these lists of the objects that an assessor could ask for, look at, or the people who they could talk to. And so I really find that to be interesting because within the CMMC model, we have maturity requirements that require things like policies or documented processes. Or when we look at the interview tables here and we see assigned responsibilities, that we're doing resource planning here. And then even at CMMC level 1, just simple performance, the ability to demonstrate the performance of something as an observable process or a testable mechanism very much fits into that paradigm. So what I see here is that this often neglected, barely reviewed document that so few people used when it first came out has a wealth of information that can help us inform process maturity requirements and also the overall CMMC assessment process itself and how we might choose to perform in light of that. So let's jump to my next dumpster find here. So the other thing that I think is really important is understanding how we can leverage cross-referenced materials from the CMMC model to maybe forecast beyond some things that we don't have yet. So I'm kind of likening the CMMC model as sort of a course syllabus, if you will, for a larger body of knowledge. This model obviously isn't the totality of everything we need to know and understand in order to be assessed. Well, for one, we don't have a CMMC assessment guide at this moment in time. So knowing that that is not here yet tells us that there's a bigger body of knowledge that needs to be understood and developed in order for us to be successful. But I think just as importantly, we have to have answers to the questions that are going to be unveiled in that assessment guide. So if we begin to think of the CMMC model as sort of like our course materials always come with required reading. And so I think we need to figure out where we could go to get a better idea of what our outcomes should look like. So I'm kind of describing this as book answers to your practice test, practice obviously being a double entendre with CMMC practices. So let me just walk you through an example of that. Let's go to the next slide. So when we are looking at CMMC practices, more often than not, the CMMC practice will be mapped to a much larger control catalog called 853. So Special Publication 853 was originally written for the federal agencies to worry about, but increasingly the goal is to turn it into a commercially usable catalog of controls. Now, why am I spending all the time to describe this? Well, here's the thing. If we take a CMMC practice and dial back the clock to what it was under 801.71 as a requirement, and then go into 801.71a and start plucking out those individual assessment objectives, we can start to take a look at what those mean if we were to go find a home for them inside of 853. So what I'm showing you here is in the first column, we have a CMMC practice, SI 2.212, has to do with updating your malicious code protections. And from 801.71, if I just strip the requirement verbiage off of it, that my assessment objective is to determine if these mechanisms are updated when new releases are available. Okay, that seems like a good match pair. So then if I go into the malicious code protection requirements, or I should say controls from 853, I can find this specific subpart under my syllabus column, part B, which, gosh, that looks almost exactly like what I'm describing, maybe with a few more words. It's talking about things like policy and procedures, for example, but basically the same end goal. Now, why does that matter? I don't do mapping exercises just for the fun of it. So what I find once I have this particular subpart identified is I can go shopping for potential technical implementations. The simple fact is that there's a lot of technical tools out there that have been mapped to 853, and there are almost none that have been mapped to CMMC. So as long as I know that I'm accomplishing an 853 objective, I can go look and see what has been documented for how to do that. So all I have here in my answer column, again, this is not a definitive answer, this is just an example, is a specific firewall setting that has already been mapped by the DoD to SI3 subpart B. So you can see here that I can start to sort of pre-fill some of the potential answers that I might have for assessors by understanding how a CMMC requirement, which is already referenced to 853, might already have an open book answer key in the form of things like publicly vetted baselines and things like that. I'll show you another example here. Next slide. We have a configuration management requirement for least functionality. And again, just to walk back through that, I've picked out an assessment objective from 800-171A. I found a home for it in 853. Turns out that it's a spitting image of CM7A. And then if I go looking for publicly vetted baselines that have mapped settings or instructions related to that subpart, I find a specific Windows setting. Well, actually, there's a lot of Windows settings attached to that subpart, but this is just an example. I wouldn't think of the answers that I'm giving you here as multiple choice right-wrong questions. Think of your answer as much more of an essay on an exam. There's probably far more than one way that you can solve for these. But if you can see how other people have answered those questions using 853, it's really going to help you frame out the overall effort. So what else could we have that we find that oftentimes are overlooked in other people's strategies for CMMC, maybe older documents that need to have some of the dust scraped off of them before we start looking at it? Let's go to the next slide, and I can show you another example of that. Our third find here are system security engineering documents. These are twin documents released by NIST. They're 800-160, Special Publication 800-160, volumes 1 and 2. These are all about system security engineering. There's some really great resources in these documents that really explain how you might design a system that accomplishes all of the practices that are described in CMMC. Sort of give it some shape and form. So if we go to the next slide, I really want to show you an excellent example from the appendix of volume 1. And I think this really helps shape a lot of conversations that you might have with organizations who are implementing CMMC, because not all practices are created equal. Sometimes a practice is very technology driven. It's practically describing a common system setting that you know you need to put in place. But other times, and I would say this is especially true for many of the CMMC practices that sort of kick off a domain, those came from FIPS 200 from their original genesis, and those are written very broadly and very open to interpretation. A lot of times we have to address those topics at a really high level. So you can see here in this diagram, we might have high level strategic objectives for our overall program. We might need to attack that issue down at a organizational security policy level. So that might be more operations driven, or we might need to get down into the nerdy weeds and start talking about it at a system security policy level. And at that point, a lot of times we're even specifying those individual settings. So if I've got a CMMC practice around account lockouts, for example, or using a validated type of encryption, that's very much going to be a system security policy. But if I'm going to talk about personnel screening or physically securing the building, or if I'm going to talk about my overall risk strategy for mitigating risk, that probably needs to happen a lot higher up. So this helps to separate out the CMMC practices that are far less the responsibility of a systems engineer or a sysadmin, and way more oriented around boardroom level conversations that need to happen in the business. The other final diagram that I'll show you here actually didn't come from 160. This comes from a really important document put out by NIST, 837, which is the risk management framework. And I just wanted to point this out because I end up using this diagram in conversations all of the time, because it helps people understand the difference between systems that actually handle CUI. Think of those as the ones in that darker triangle in the middle. Then we've got the environment of operation around those systems. So those could still be in the same network, for example, but they're not CUI handling systems. They're not covered contractor systems per se. But they still have a role, and they're still covered by the blanket of security capabilities that the organization uses. Then we've got these outside systems that are enabling systems. They may not even be under the direct control of the organization. It might be an external service or a managed service provider. But somehow, some way, the systems of operation or the environment of operation or the actual covered contractor systems inherit security from what that outside system provides. So in the 853 world, we'd call that a common control provider. This is really important because it gives us a concept around which we can figure out, can outside service providers deliver things into the environment to be inherited? Can a cloud service provider deliver reciprocity or meet something on our behalf in their data center? These are all really important discussions to have. So having said that, these are some of the findings, some of the things that I've dug up out of the past, the ghosts of prior NIST special publications and other things that might help organizations who are looking to start somewhere, even when they don't have the latest and greatest, shiniest CMMC resources hot off the press. So with that, I'll hand it back over to Tim, and thanks everyone for showing up today.
Thank you very much, Ryan. At this time, I'm going to turn things over to Pat from NeQter Labs and talk about some technology. Pat?
Hey, thanks, Tim. So yeah, I'm Pat Colantonio from NeQter Labs, co-founder, director of sales, and compliance therapist. But following those two talks, I mean, this is going to look big dumb, but we're going to go over talking about affordable SIEM for small business. Next slide. So one of the biggest things I wanted to tackle on this presentation was reviewing really just a lot of questions. So the biggest key to compliance is to find the right answers. You need to ask the right questions. And one of the biggest questions comes around what a SIEM tool is and how that can be implemented successfully in order to meet different compliance objectives. So we're going to be going over the what and why of SIEM. We're going to be going over environment considerations for vendor compliance, cost, time, expertise. And we're also going to be talking about the right team. And then we're going to touch upon SOC at the end of the presentation. Next slide. So Security Information Event Management, or SIEM, is a software solution that aggregates and analyzes activity. There's a lot of different definitions for what a SIEM is. It can be very fluid depending on which vendor you're talking to, and all of the answers are right when people are defining what a SIEM is, because it can mean a very limited scope, can also be wide-ranging and perform a lot of functions. A SIEM is an integral part of being able to meet the auditing and ability requirements for both NIST and for CMMC compliance with NIST, auditing and accountability, section 3.3, and with CMMC levels 1 through 3. Obviously, it is integral to 4 and 5 as well, but we're going to be talking about mostly the one-to-one of 800, 171 and levels 1 through 3 of CMMC today. Next slide. In terms of identifying a SIEM tool, the first thing that really needs to happen, and of course this also needs to happen majorly when it comes to meeting and addressing the compliance is what is the scope of the environment that that SIEM tool is going to be living in? What type of environment is it? Is it an on-prem? Is it hybrid? Is it cloud? Because depending on which environment, there's obviously different vendors that are successful at cloud only or on-prem only, or there's also vendors in the middle that can meet both with a hybrid solution. So understanding the scope of the environment, what applications, devices, and other integrations are you planning to ingest? And then therefore on the flip side, how many native devices does that SIEM support? What type of native support does the SIEM provide for the relevant log sources that you're looking to meet? And that leads into my next topic. Next slide, please. So another thing as well, especially when it comes down to CMMC, is understanding ownership of the vendor, understanding the location and citizenship of support technicians, because this rolls up into ITAR considerations and CUI restrictions. Where is the data stored, transmitted, or processed with a CUI system? It's going to also translate into who can have access to that system. And it also, as we move forward in the presentation, we're going to understand as well what level of service can you expect supporting the SIEM, and that also will translate into who can have access to the environment at large. Next slide, please. So one of the biggest things, of course, comes down to cost, especially with small business, all size businesses, but especially small business. And understanding the cost model of the SIEM, of the platform. Is it open source? Is it a singular tool set? Is SIEM the only thing that it does? And that's fine. It can do it well, but you might also be considering it up against a multi-purpose platform that SIEM is just a component. Or as we get into the towards the end of the presentation, talking about the SOC model, is it a fully managed platform? Is that something that you're investing time on with your team in your company? So cost, of course, considers licensing, software features, initial installation, as well as ongoing support. But it also comes down to, if you're looking at open source, or you're looking all the way on the other end of the spectrum with a fully managed SIEM, time and effort and energy and resources are also going to need to be considered in all areas. So while open source is a freemium model, how much time is going to be spent standing up that environment? How much time is going to be continued to spend on maintenance and making sure that it gets the support that it needs? Because open source might have a $0 association with it. However, it really comes down to a leverage conversation of one side of the seesaw on the cost and the resources and installation. And then also when it comes down to installing the solution, is it something where you're going to get resources from the company? Are you going to have to spin stuff up yourself? Is it hosted in their cloud? So when it comes down to cost, whether or not, again, going back to the on-prem or cloud conversation, the cost models are very different depending on events per second or gigabytes worth of or cost per gigabyte, things like that. And then scalability. Can the product grow with you? The cost model that you have today, is your company going to grow by 10%, 30%? Is it going to double in the next 5 years? And can that platform grow with you? Because the same platform you buy today may not be the platform that's ideal for your company in a couple of years' time. Next slide, please. Another one is time, which I briefly talked about on the previous slide. Time factors include evaluation, of course, spending time to make sure, is this the right solution for me? Then you decide, hey, this is the one that we're going to go forward with. Installation, what does that look like? And that also goes into cost. Installation, how much time of the resources of your team How much time and expense is it going to be? Is installation included? Is that an extra outside service cost that's not tied directly into the software licensing cost? And same goes for maintenance. From a report generation standpoint, is that tool ready to go day one, or will it require a couple weeks worth of report creation, generation, getting the information that you need out of that platform? Or is this going to be something that takes several weeks or several months to properly attune to your company and needs? And then it goes into continuous monitoring and response as well. How much time is going to be used responding to the platform, continuously monitoring and understanding what events are happening within your environment? That goes into the compliance conversation as well. And then ongoing education with the software stack that you choose to go with. How often is it changing? How often do the resources that you have, your team, need to get retrained up on that platform to successfully manage it and deploy it? So, and that leads into the last topic in this area. Next slide, please. Is the platform compliance focused? It doesn't need to be necessarily, but much like the time and the resources and the cost associated, it really comes down to, is the SIEM solution directly translated to the CMMC compliance, or is their team knowledgeable about that fact, or is that expertise and that time and that knowledge coming from your end of the equation? But then on the nuts and bolts, the very specific elements, the technical elements of the platform, is it meeting the log retention requirements? Where are those logs stored? That might get into those previous considerations about physically where are those logs being stored, how are they being accessed, and do you have full access to those logs in the event of an incident? What does your service agreement with the company look like on requesting access to logs? What is that timetable? Or do you have direct access at all times day one? Additionally, what indicator is the SIEM providing for an incident? Again, different platforms have different capabilities, whether they be cybersecurity, whether they be general networking. So what indicators does the SIEM already provide for an incident? What forensic capabilities can the SIEM provide? And lastly, does the platform have any reports that indicate adherence to the CMMC compliance? Again, that's not a deal breaker. However, what level of time and effort is going to be spent on your end facilitating those answers? And is that something that will be ultimately up to you and your team, or whether your IT team be internal or external or both, which really leads into the next topic. Next slide, please. So expertise is a major resource consideration. Who is going to be managing this platform, and ultimately who's going to be responsible for it? So a lot of companies start off with thinking, okay, internally, well, my IT guy or my IT team, they're going to handle that. However, is the expertise there? Do you have the right team internally to accomplish that? If so, awesome. That saves a lot of time and effort. But has your team used a tool like this in the past? What is the learning curve from the install to successful daily use? I mean, it's one thing to work with a setup team on the vendor side. Okay, great. We got everything set up. Everything is pushing. Everything's good to go. But past that, they go away. You're left with the platform. Are you successfully able to use it, manage it, handle the data management aspects of that platform, handle the reporting aspects of that platform, and then, of course, the adherence to the compliance? How is that going to be handled? So ultimately, do you need to augment your team with outside expertise, and will this be something that will be externally managed potentially fully? Those are all questions that need to be asked. So slide. So it really comes down to who's on first, what's on second. I don't know who's on third. So who is going to be managing the SIEM, and ultimately who is going to be responsible for it? Something I had mentioned previously. This may involve your overall approach to IT, cybersecurity, and compliance. Is this a pure internal or external function, or both? You may have 3 separate teams, one for IT, one for cybersecurity, one for compliance. However, those teams might be 1 internal, 2 external, or a combination of all of the above. Ultimately, do you have the right people for the job at hand when it comes to the SIEM platform? And of course, that's a conversation for SIEM, but also every single other platform that's been reviewed through the past couple of weeks of these webinars, or policies or procedures. Those are obviously theme questions that need to be asked, but specifically for SIEM, the same applies. Next slide, please. So the last bit I wanted to tie in, because typically there's a lot of same thing with a SIEM tool, a security operations center as a service, or SOC as a service, is an element that needs to be considered for SIEM. A lot of SIEM providers have a SOC tied in, or vice versa. SOC providers obviously need a SIEM tool of choice for them to provide their services meaningfully. So much like the rest of the prior discussion, I know that when usually vendors talk about or review the different elements of a SIEM, it's okay, well, here are the features. Well, all these questions that we've talked about today center around a lot of really features are important. However, you need to understand the environment, you need to understand the team, you need to understand the cost, you need to understand the effort to put into all the things that I've reviewed today. And ultimately SOC ties into that as well. And it's never going to be an apples to apples typically in this SIEM software space, because everyone offers something different. Everyone offers different features. And again, what is the goal of the SIEM? Is it for, of course, to meet the compliance objectives, pull in auditing logs, be able to monitor them and detect potential incidents, but all those other features of a different dark web tracing, or a different live cybersecurity feeds, and is the SIEM tied into or a bolt-on add-on for an endpoint detection or endpoint solution. So it is a very fluid conversation, and the same thing goes for SOC as a service. It's fluid and can range from a service provider offering basic 24/7 network monitoring to a full-blown threat detection and mitigation service. And so each vendor has their own collection of services that they may label as SOC as a service. It's a very arbitrary term. Same goes for SIEM, and these questions are important. So I believe it's my last slide. Next slide, please. So considerations for SOC, obviously could have a whole 20 minutes talking about this. And this is something that we as NeQter Labs deal with and work with different partners. But considerations for SOC, it's important to consider the service level agreements that you have with that service provider. What is the level of response? And what is the type of response? Because you may have a SOC and 2 different SOC providers. One is one price, one is another price. You're looking at it's per agent, it's per month, or it's they have different methods that they attribute cost to. So you can get a quote, but ultimately, okay, is this a 30-minute window? Is this a 5-minute window? Is this a 24-hour window of a service level agreement? And what is the type of response? Is it merely, and this comes down to the team discussion again, is it passive? Are they just letting your team know, or your augmented team know about a potential incident? Or is this an active mechanism that's tied into either endpoint protection, or even being able to configure, shut things on the boundary, or different security equipment that you have, being able to have that call and response of detected incident, shutdown, or a quarantine. I know that's a very triggering term this year, but quarantining different assets, shutting stuff down to make sure that it's safe and then opening them up again. What is the type of response that you have from that service? And the same thing goes, much like the SIEM side, what is the ultimate goal that you're looking for of the SOC? Because you can be looking at much different price ranges, even though they may be using the same terms to describe their service in there, and they're both right, or everyone's right. They are providing a SOC, but is it 24/7 network monitoring? Is it a full-blown threat detection and mitigation response? And what level of incident response can be expected from that SOC provider? Is it included in their offering, in their price point, how they do their licensing? Can it be added so that, you know, the team that is reviewing those events and knows your system and is setting those baselines, are they providing additional incident response services? Or if they don't offer it, do they have it through a partner? Or is that something that you're going to be ending up holding the bag and needing to, because that's the worst phone call that you have to make. Something was detected, something was respond, and then you need to get incident response for those things. So I know that there were very few answers that were gone over through my presentation today, but all of these questions are essential for properly evaluating when you need to meet auditing and accountability for NIST, for CMMC, and you're evaluating different tool sets. These are the questions that are top of mind of going back through the environment, the cost, all of the resource elements of time, personnel, expertise, being able to be armed with those questions so that you can properly evaluate vendors and make sure that you're making the right choice when it comes to this area of CMMC compliance. So with that, that's my time. Thanks everyone for listening. And nobody knew this, but I lost power, so I had to do this from my phone. So I apologize for any audio lack of clarity. So thank you.
All right, everybody, we're going to stop and take a 10-minute break. We will come back at 2:25, and up after the break, we have in-front compliance, steel route, and DGC.